This week on the Communicators, several of the nation's top cybersecurity analysts look at the nature of cyber threats against the U.S. and what they'd suggest to strengthen U.S. systems. We talk with James Lewis of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Alan Poller of the SANS Institute, and Catherine Lotriante of Georgetown University. This is the final segment in a month-long series on cybersecurity.
Well, this is week 4 in our look on the Communicators at cybersecurity and cyber threats that face the U.S. And this week, we've invited 3 cybersecurity experts to join us to talk about some of these issues. First off, James Lewis, who is the Director of the Technology and Public Policy Program at CSIS. He also worked on the President's recent cybersecurity report. Also joining us is Catherine Lotriante. She is the director of the Cybersecurity Project at Georgetown University. She served in the General Counsel Office at the CIA and also worked on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board during the George W. Bush administration. Alan Poller is the founder and research director of the SANS Institute, which teaches cybersecurity training, and he was also an advisor to both the President Clinton and President Bush administrations at different levels. Thank you all for being here today. We sure appreciate it. If I could start with a question for all 3 of you, and Mr. Poller, we'll start with you. How would you assess the cybersecurity threats currently facing the U.S., and are we doing enough to confront them?
They're explosive, they're expansive, they're getting larger and they're getting more sophisticated. And although we're doing a lot, we're falling further and further behind every week.
Why? Because
the technology of the attackers is accelerating and the sharing of data among the attackers is elegant. And our technology to stop it is just not catching up, and our sharing is abysmal.
So what's the solution?
We actually know what to do, meaning people have found wonderful solutions across 4 different arenas, but most people aren't doing them. So you have examples where good things are happening and a whole lot of reasons why other people aren't doing them, and most of the reasons are money. And I don't mean they don't have enough money. I mean people are making so much money doing the wrong thing that they don't want to switch over and do the right thing.
Catherine Lotriante.
So to the threats, they are getting more sophisticated and complicated, and that'll continue. In terms of what we're doing on the defensive side, you can never do enough defensively, and it's never going, there's no such thing as perfect security. So there'll be a movement, and I think there is, to think off of the defensive side and start thinking more offensively. And we're talking at a nation-state level. So international engagement becomes critically important.
Can you give an example of what you mean by offense?
So it is very much tied to the defense, and they're technologically related as well as the policy and legal are interconnected. And part of doing defense well is knowing the offensive capabilities and actually using them. So if you know that your security is not ever going to be 100%, then it's logical to come to the conclusion, and many have, that you will start seeing what is sometimes referred to as a more aggressive defense. So as we get into the area of more aggressive defense, whether from the government or private sector, and this is an important aspect of the role of the private sector, that is, in effect, offensive work. But some have termed it more aggressive defense, more aggressive security. And
James Lewis, same question.
I actually don't believe in threats. I think what you have is a remarkably insecure infrastructure, built that way, insecurable the way the internet works now. And you have people who take advantage of it, and there's criminals, spies, armies. Eventually maybe we'll see terrorists. So what I see is a place where there's no penalty for doing bad things, and it's probably unfixable. So when I look at it, I think, what is it we need to change to make this a safer environment? So far, we haven't done very much. The U.S. position has been to rely on the private sector and to rely on market forces. That works so well in all other fields of national security. No, it doesn't work at all, and that's part of why we're in a mess. So we need to rethink what we're doing, and that's proving to be very difficult in the current political climate.
Insecurable, unfixable, in a mess. What And so what about cybersecurity keeps you awake at night? What is your biggest fear?
Nothing keeps me awake at night about cybersecurity. I don't think we're facing any sort of drastic attack in the near future. Right now, as far as I can tell, the only people who have the capabilities that could do real harm are big countries like China, Russia, a few others. They're not just going to attack us for fun. When you see those capabilities spread to people like the jihadis or to North Korea, then we'll have to worry. And you know, it depends. People say usually we have somewhere between 2 and 5 years before the true nuts get cyber attack capabilities. So I don't worry too much. You know, sometimes I worry that, you know, a Chinese spy or a Russian criminal might accidentally trip over something in cyberspace and cause an immense blackout or crash Wall Street. But that's the only thing we have to worry about, is somebody who's playing around and makes a mistake.
Ellen Peller, what's your response to that?
I think while we're, a parallel I use is the automobile. We have traditionally tried in the automobile world. 50 years ago we said drivers need to drive more safely, and they were still dying in large numbers. It wasn't until we made the cars safer and the roads safer that we began to have a chance to have people driving safely and staying healthy. We're building what Jim, I don't know exactly what Jim means, but I think what he means is the computers that are coming out are indefensible. And they're indefensible because it's cheaper to build an indefensible system than to build one that you can defend. And the networks that we work on are not defending us, meaning if you work at a Boeing, Boeing protects you as an employee. If you don't and you work with an ISP, they don't do anything to protect you unless you pay a whole lot of money. So we have networks that are unsafe, we have computers that are unsafe, and users who do make mistakes, but the users making mistakes are the smallest part of that.
I think we will just have to accept and get used to working on networks in a system where it is unsecure, and we have to anticipate that we've been compromised and learn how to operate while we're compromised. I think that's the reality of it. But I mean, good hygiene, all of that, the standards, all good to do. I still believe there will not be 100% security. I think I spend most of my time thinking about the calculated strategic approach of nation states in this space. And there are states that have reorganized themselves, created equivalent of cyber commands, have hired and trained as part of their military army cyber warriors. And when states do that, they're serious about it. Now, it may not be tomorrow that we see that, and they may start with the theft of intellectual property that had happened prior to engagement in conventional warfare. But it is more of the state to state, and even those that Jim refers to on, you know, the crazy individuals or the lone wolf, whether it's a terrorist or not, they're in somebody's jurisdiction, in someone's state. And so key to that is the engagement with the state actors and to get at even the lone individuals that are doing this.
But one thing maybe we want to make clear is that I don't think there's ever going to be a pure cyber war. You might see terrorists do a cyber attack, a standalone, but no country is crazy enough to depend on cyber weapons because they're just not that good, right? So you could do some harm. You're not going to win any wars with a cyber attack.
Let me bring into the conversation Siobhan Gorman of the Wall Street Journal.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Following on the threat question, we've seen a lot more public acknowledgement of cyber attacks in the last year, which has been interesting. And I wonder, I mean, because we've seen a slew of discussions about, you know, the attempts on NASDAQ, the attempts on Sony, the attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, an attack on the computer security firm RSA. I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of these attacks that has concerned you, if anything, or if this slew of attacks actually shouldn't be of concern. Maybe start with Jim.
They should be of concern, but none of it's particularly new. You have espionage. It's been going on since the early 1980s. You have crime, very lucrative. I'm kind of sorry I'm not in a business some days. Very lucrative cyber crime that's been going on for at least a decade. And then you have the military potential. And a few years ago at Idaho National Labs, we saw the tests that showed you could destroy critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. So none of this is new. What concerns me is that we're having a hard time figuring out how to protect ourselves. Right now we're still sort of depending on, I don't know, fasting and prayer, and I don't think it's working very well.
Catherine.
I think that the Stuxnet on the attack on the Iranian nuclear facility was a significant game changer. It indicates and shows that the cyber, it is not just limited, but that is a problem on the intellectual property theft and espionage, but that this is a political tool, one that can be legitimate. Self-defense, you can make a number of arguments, but that was a significant, I mean, you could point to Georgia and Estonia too, but I think Stuxnet was an indication of where we're at and where states may go.
Alan?
And with Catherine on Stuxnet, it had one troubling effect, and that is that although it was targeted only one site, about 15,000 copies of it got out in order to get to that site, and every one of those copies is in the hands of people who can learn from it. And two things happened. One is it became acceptable in some circles to use cyber attack to do physical damage to critical resources, and two, the resources are out there. But I guess I'm on a different wavelength. I think that this, I call it the awakening, this public knowledge. I think it may be what was needed to stop the historical pattern of security that people like to write about it and not do anything about it. And although we can't get to 100%, we can raise the bar a lot higher without damaging operations. We can do a lot of good if we get out of the let's write another report about security and spend our money in actually making systems more secure.
But when you mentioned Stuxnet and particularly all of the copies now that are floating around, what do you make of the response we've seen so far from the U.S. and other governments and private industry? I mean, is the U.S. government now prepared if someone were to try to mount such an attack on some of our critical infrastructure? Is private industry prepared at this point? Have they now responded, now that we all know what that threat is at least? What's the response?
It has been minimal. There's a stick your head in the sand. When the first big espionage attacks were reported by Time magazine, the response of the government was to claim it didn't happen, and then when they couldn't prove it didn't happen, to change its name and classify it so nobody could talk about it anymore because it didn't exist. Meaning, stick your head in the sand when you don't know a solution seems to be the main government response. That's true in the critical infrastructure. There's a concept for stopping these kinds of attacks called the kill chain, where you follow every single step along the attack chain and you put in defenses at every step, so if they get past 3 of them, they can't get past the 4th one. We're not doing that. We're going in and writing reports about vulnerabilities in the utilities without even looking at how Stuxnet was done and what you'd have to do to stop it.
But one thing people need to face up to is that we cannot protect ourselves against the high-end attacks, no more than we can protect ourselves always against a missile or an aircraft or a terrorist group. So the people who are at the top of the game are going to be able to get through, and we'll need to think of other ways: resiliency, deterrence, military doctrine, along with the hardening of critical infrastructure. There's always an opportunity because a lot of this depends on tricking one person, and I can tell you now that for every 1,000 people I can trick at least one.
Catherine Lotrianti, you mentioned earlier state players. Is China a threat, and is the Chinese government, in your view, directing some of these cyber attacks?
So in terms of the reporting and what has been discussed publicly already, there's pretty good indication that at least with 2 states, that there's indication that they're, if not explicitly conducting them, at least backing them through other parties, proxies. That is a significant problem which complicates attribution when policymakers actually want to make decisions as to what the proper response would be from the U.S., for instance, if we were a target. And it's gone beyond, the major concern right now is intellectual property theft, which is a problem for national security. But we're moving, and we're seeing with Stuxnet, we're moving beyond that it's not limited to just stealing a country's secrets or technological advancement. So with whatever, if it's China, if it's Russia, and if it's proxies, we need to have our own doctrine prepared, our policies in line with international law, that what our response would be in the case of a state using proxies to attack us, and what would be our defenses. If the defense is not perfect, one might then, as in traditional times in the Cold War with the Soviets, have to think of more of the aggressive defensive moves, or what would be considered by some as offensive, whether kinetic or cyber. And DoD has just said in their strategy that they reserve the right to respond to a cyber attack with kinetic force. It may be wiser to respond with kinetic force, it may not. You still have cyber options, but the offense needs to be connected to any discussion on the security side.
Just to take this proxy a little further, just to make it clear, for example, in China, every PLA district, People's Liberation Army District, has a competition every spring where they pick up people who they've captured, who they've found were doing hacking into other people's systems, and they put them in these competitions, and the ones who win go into intense 30-day workshops where they learn advanced techniques, but they don't go into the government. They kind of are outside the government, but accessible to them. We've tracked a couple of them that have done some really deep penetration into the Defense Department, and yet they won the contest, but they weren't on the military payroll. That's just to color what Catherine was talking about.
There are students in China, for instance, to get an A, you are to exhibit and demonstrate how you can break into one of the most supposedly secure systems. If I were that student, and that was the goal of the class, I would pick something like NSA, see if I can break into NSA. Now, whether the government funds, encourages that through the universities, and backs it, and is just the recipient of whatever goods come from that, or the students don't necessarily have to work for the government. So there are different levels of witting and unwitting proxies. But the key to that is leveraging through diplomacy, hopefully before any military engagement, with the states to get an understanding of what is acceptable behavior emanating from a state, whether it's from your student body or your private companies or individuals. What's acceptable and the state's responsibility to make sure no other territory or state is harmed from something emanating from your country.
While we're doing the diplomacy, we need to remember that in that part of warfare or part of economic competition, the weapons in the next competition will be people, and we're way behind on the people side. Our colleges aren't teaching people how to defend computers or how to develop new techniques. Our high schools aren't teaching the basics. Our middle schools aren't teaching programming. We're so far off the path. We do have a wonderful thing that Jim helped with called the U.S. Cyber Challenge, which is a big national competition. Thousands of kids are engaged, very positive, not the kind of negative pressure that PLA is doing that is finding wonderful kids, but we're way behind. We need to ratchet that up at a very fast rate.
One thing you want to think about, though, is that we can split up different categories of this. So the Chinese are the best at economic espionage, and they have an advantage there because the U.S. doesn't do economic espionage. The Russians are the best at financial crime, and they have an advantage there because the U.S. does not permit or engage in financial crime. But the U.S. is best at traditional intelligence collection, and we do that against them. So when we talk about things like aggressive responses, we might not want to set that precedent because some people might say, what are you guys complaining about? You're tromping all over my networks. You're just as guilty as I am. And that's not true, but everybody's playing in this game, and any solution has to take that into account.
Jim, you had mentioned earlier that in addition to just sort of basic protective measures, there need to be policy measures taken as well, such as deterrence, in order to kind of create a bunch of different layers of cyber defense. What's your assessment of how far along the U.S. is in deciding on its policies of, what is deterrence in cyberspace? What is an act of war in cyberspace? Some of these things that probably need to be clear if you're really going to make use of those sort of policy tools.
The Obama administration has actually made a lot of good progress, and so I think we're further along than sometimes might be the public appearance. And in deterrence, pretty good idea. We have something called cross-domain deterrence, which is this, you do cyber, I do a missile. That's a good idea. The issue with deterrence is there are some things that are not deterrable through military force, and that gets into the definition of an attack. So espionage, crime, don't usually justify a military response. We're really good at deterring military attacks. We aren't deterring espionage or crime. And that's because the definition that people are revolving around hasn't been formally accepted yet around the world. But where we're coming out is, this is just like any other kind of military conflict. The laws of armed conflict that exist now apply. And it's not an attack if there isn't physical damage or casualties. A little bit of a gray area there, but people are moving in that direction. I don't want to talk too much, but the area of greatest dispute is that our fuzzy foreign friends are making the argument that we need to expand attack to include information warfare. And that's because they say that ideas are information warfare. One security official from one of these countries once told me, Twitter is an American plot to destabilize foreign governments. They really believe that, and that's because they fear ideas. But for me, an idea is not a weapon. Compelling someone through force or the threat of force is an act that falls under armed conflict. Telling someone a different idea and trying to persuade them, that's not warfare. But we're going to have big fights over that in the future.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Catherine and Alan, what sorts of examples of cyber attacks would actually fall in the category of warfare, an act of war, as opposed to espionage and some of these, and crime and some other things that we sort of tolerate?
So that is probably one of the most important topics to get states to start specifically discussing, under their view and interpretation in the cyber context, what would constitute a use of force versus an armed attack, which triggers, of course, the self-defense provisions of the UN Charter. Espionage, also known as at least one of the oldest professions, or at least done ever since the creation of states. Espionage is, one, not criminalized under international law. There is no treaty that prohibits and outlaws spying, clandestine collection of information. The use of force, or the threat of use of force, against the political independence or sovereign integrity of a state is prohibited under the UN Charter. Defining and understanding in the cyber context what would be a threat or use of force, and you can't forget, it's a particular type of use of force against political independence, sovereign integrity. So not all uses of force will trigger that prohibition, but there are exceptions under the Charter. If you have suffered an armed attack, the state can actually, has one of the strongest exceptions under Article 51. What amounts to an armed attack under cyber is what we really have to start getting agreement on. Some have advocated the mere attack against a critical infrastructure is automatically considered an armed attack under the UN Charter and will trigger then the legitimate self-defense mechanisms of the state, military as well.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Possibly. I say we start with that. We recognize that some states may view that, and now let's look back at our critical infrastructure and what that would mean. The policy people that's what we expect or need policy people to focus on. The use of force that threshold is lower than the armed attack. You can have, and some have opined that espionage may rise to the level of use of force. Covert action typically is accepted as a use of force, but espionage not. And so that in cyber, we need to distinguish exploitation, which there's a lot going on, which we do and other states do, from what would be an armed attack. If we get agreement from at least some key state actors that have the capability on, well, this is what we would perceive an armed attack to be, therefore we don't want to go there.
Well, say somebody unleashed an attack like Stuxnet on the U.S. Does that constitute an armed attack?
So Stuxnet is really interesting because you have to look at the facts around what was the justification or the legitimacy, if you will, for that. Arguably, one might propose that it was a self-defense move that against their nuclear facility. Now, even if you have justification under the UN Charter for a self-defense argument, you still need to make sure that your action is proportionate to the threat. And that we get back to consequences after you've conducted it in cyber. What are those? How do we know what the consequences will be? So it has to be proportional, even if you've got justification. So if you did something without legitimate justification under self-defense, like a Stuxnet, then it can be viewed as an unlawful use of force and could be arguably rising to the level of an armed attack, depending on how a state interprets that.
Well, okay, say in the Stuxnet example, then it's deemed an armed attack, and you're inclined or you're approved to take some sort of defensive action. Who do you go after in self-defense in the Stuxnet example? I mean, at this point, we don't know who did it. There's been speculation that there was.
Let's put a little caveat on that, though, because if there's an effect that's equivalent to physical damage, you could argue it's an attack. There's still a decision that has to be made, probably by the president, about whether this is an act of war that justifies a U.S. response.
Right.
Normally, we don't respond. And so if you think of Khobar Towers or the Beirut bombing, we know who did that. We know which state was behind it. And we took no overt military action against them. The same thing's going to happen here. The president will have to decide, do I want to pick a fight this week? Am I too busy with all my other little wars? You know, how do I deal with this?
Well, you could also authorize covert action, right? So then you're doing sort of a secret attack back. So, but I am wondering, I mean, in the Stuxnet example is actually really instructive here because nobody has been able to say with certainty who was behind it. Yeah. So what do you do in that circumstance? Say that the president wants to do that.
I like to leave those questions to Catherine and Jim.
So are you asking that it's the attribution problem?
Yeah. What do you do? Say there's something that has been deemed to be an armed attack where self-defense some self-defensive action is justified, whether it's covert or overt. What do you do when you can't pinpoint it?
Okay, so I was actually going with that the Stuxnet itself was a legitimate self-defense move.
Okay.
So, I mean, the question is still relevant in terms of attribution, but you would have to know the facts of what your target was and whether in taking those actions that could rise to the level of a use of force and an armed attack. And using the word act of war, it's actually irrelevant. Domestic purposes, constitutional separation of powers, yes, but under an analysis of international law, the word war is not even used in the constitutive relevant provisions of the Charter. It's if you suffered an armed attack, you have the authority, if one chooses. Of course, you're not compelled to have to respond. Often, like Khobar Towers, USS Cole, it often depends on if you have enough information in which to base, because under international law, you clearly have to know who the perpetrator was before you take an action against a potentially innocent party. So attribution will be a problem, but on the Stuxnet, I was actually saying that if Stuxnet, one could argue that it was a legitimate self-defense move in and of itself. Now, you do worry about the tit for tat and that going on.
But you probably know this, and it's probably good for the audience to know, the ability of the U.S. to attribute an attack using intelligence means is extremely high. Attribution is not a problem, okay? The problem is making a decision. Do I want to start a war with China now, or do I want to let it ride? Yeah. But attribution as a problem is routinely overstated because people are unaware of the classified side of this.
Yeah, what you're saying is this isn't just a technical question. You can use human sources or other types of intelligence to figure out, just like with any sort of attack, where someone was trying to cover their tracks, who did it.
And I'd like to take just a orthogonal view just for a minute. We've sort of not written off, but we're working on warfare. We sort of went by espionage because it's been going on forever. And normally you can do that, but in this particular case, the espionage also has a massive economic effect on the United States. So it is military information, and it's terrible what we're losing. But every time you as an industry are doing business with another nation in Asia, your computers and your lawyers' computers are being taken over, and your documents are being stolen, so that when you're negotiating with them, you're not going to get as good a deal because they know more about your playbook than you do. And you heard about the Google attack a year and a half ago. That was one of 80 companies whose intellectual property, and what I mean by intellectual property is current products, future products, engineering work on new products, so other people who want to compete with us don't have to do all that R&D. So it's not just espionage in the old sense of espionage. I wanted to
It's industrial espionage.
It's industrial espionage, and is having a massive economic impact as well as a military impact.
Well, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, back in the 80s, we were worried about the Japanese, right? And we were worried that they were getting technology and leaping ahead of us. China as well, through the theft of our intellectual property. It is a national security concern.
Indeed.
But under policy and legal decisions of how one responds to espionage versus a use of force or an armed attack is different. There are different rules at play as to what one does using law enforcement efforts, possibly, versus internationally recognized authority to use force, military force.
Sometimes people say, well, the U.S. stole intellectual property from Britain in the 19th century, and isn't that part of what helped make us grow? And so shouldn't we not criticize the Chinese for doing this? And my answer is always that we should tell the Chinese, steal as many books as you like, right? And that's not, as Alan said, what's going on. It's the ability to download massive quantities of information, entire plan sets. It's also really hard. If you've ever read a book and tried, how to build your own F-16, you make a lot of mistakes. If you can get the electronic version, much simpler.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Could a 9/11 size attack occur via cyber warfare?
If your question is, could people die? Could 3,000 people die based on a nuclear accident that was facilitated through, not caused entirely by, but facilitated through cyber? Yes.
Catherine Lotrianti?
Maybe I'm a little more optimistic or hold out the hope that we're not there yet. So the anniversary is very close. I think still the biggest threat, especially on an anniversary like this, is similar to 9/11, the conventional terrorist attack.
So there is a classified example of a cyber attack that resulted in multiple deaths. And what we know from that, we can start to assess the effectiveness of this as a weapon. And it's not that powerful. You can hurt a few people, that's bad of course, but I don't think you could get a 9/11. You could have more fun doing something else. You could mess up the financial system. You could turn off the electrical power. But casualties in the thousands would be difficult to achieve using cyber attack.
And we are out of time, unfortunately. Very quickly, Jim Lewis is the director of the Technology and Public Policy Program at CSIS. He got his PhD at the University of Chicago. Also joining us today was Catherine Lotrianti, who is director of the Cybersecurity Project at Georgetown University, PhD from Georgetown University, law degree from New York University, and Alan Paller, founder and research director of the SANS Institute, degrees from Cornell and MIT. Mr. Paller, very quickly, what is the SANS Institute and how did you get involved in this type of work?
SANS is the main training organization. We train 20,000 people a year in the very advanced techniques that are used to defend computers and exploit computers. And I got involved because I started one of the first software companies and sold it to another company that was in the security area and learned it that way.
Do you train a lot of government folks?
Yeah, more commercial and defense industrial based, but a small number of the government folks in law enforcement, particularly in intelligence community.
Catherine Lotrianti, how did you get involved in working in the General Counsel Office at the CIA and in cybersecurity?
So my background in cyber started actually at CIA when I was given the information warfare account back in 1997 as a lawyer, and Solar Sunrise and Moonlight Maze were just around the corner. And kept with the interest in it and found a spot at Georgetown eventually outside the government where I could bring in what I think is necessary, a multidisciplinary approach to the topic, where you have technical sciences, the hard sciences, with the policy and legal to try to deal with some of the problems.
Jim Lewis?
When I was in school, they announced to me suddenly that I would have to learn how to write computer programs. So I thought about dropping out and eventually got through it. And a few years later, Dick Clark was walking down the hall one way, And he said to me, "You know how to program computers, don't you?" I should have said no. And instead he said, "Well, I want you to go out to NSA and talk to them." So that's how I got involved.
Also joining us today was Siobhan Gorman, who covers national security type issues for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all for being on the Communicators.
Thank you.
Sunday on News.